Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kellis, you had said that in New York that the crypto industry was going to turn on 49 plants that had been retired. Is that accurate?
No, what I said is we have 49 power plants, and the concern is that there was a trend beginning. We saw one purchased and turned back on, and another purchased in the permitting process and turned back on with existing rigs that they have. We have 49 in the state. The concern was if that trend continued without us evaluating the full impact on our ability to reach our climate goals with respect to GHG emissions, water impacts, and air quality impacts, then we might not reach our climate goals. So the idea, of course, was that we needed to stop that particular trend. And I want to be clear that this was a very narrow moratorium. It was specifically on the purchasing of retired power plants in the state by consolidated cryptocurrency mining corporations. Of course, you and I probably can't afford on our own to buy a retired power plant, but this did not pertain to those that were plugged into the grid or those using renewable energy infrastructure on site. So it was narrow, but the intention was to give us the opportunity and time to measure the full extent of the impact, which I think is fundamentally parallel to what you are trying to do with this piece of legislation, to capture the data and be able to do a full analysis.
So presumably the other plants went through a permitting process. Is that accurate? And or at least the one plant that did get up and running went through a permitting process and got permitted, and so that was in operation. Is that accurate?
So actually, the first used the permits that had been in place. They got an extension of those permits, but then they went through a renewal process this last year and actually were denied an extension of that, the air permit, because it was recognized that the permit and the activity that was being used for that facility no longer aligned with our Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. That is currently in the courts because that was appealed. That will go through, I presume, for potentially even years. But that was the initial process. The water permit was extended at the time, actually for 4 years. They were out of compliance with the permit that required that they put a screen on the pipe that was pulling water into from the lake and then into the facility, and therefore, because there wasn't the screen, it was killing wildlife, a significant amount of wildlife. Last year, they did finally put that screen in and are now compliant. They were given a couple extra months to become compliant. So that's with the water permit, and we'll see what happens with the renewal of that permit.
So it's safe to say, though, that there is a process in place for the permits, and they go through the process, and the state itself was deciding whether or not to give those permits. Is that right? I mean, you just said that the state denied them on the air permit, and so there's a way in place to be able to address the emissions, correct?
Not fully. So those are only the facilities that are in power plants. But as we've talked about, there are many different types of facilities. So they could be, many rigs inside shipping containers in a field, which is very common. They can be in a warehouse, all of those plugged into the grid. They could be plugged into the grid, but doing net metering, so paying for hydroelectric. But then there's the question of opportunity costs. So the reason for the requirement for the full environmental
generation things require, all those power generations require permitting, right? But everything that would generate power, everything that's going to provide power to any of these crypto things is going to have to be permitted, right?
No, not necessarily. If you are pulling directly from the grid and you have a warehouse on your property, even if you have a different type of business, that does not require a permit.
The power that is generated that go into that warehouse, it has to be permitted, right?
Not necessarily, no.
So you have power generation. You have power generation facilities in New York that are not permitted. So there's no power generation.
No power generation. So if you are plugged directly into the grid, you are not producing your own energy.
But somebody's producing the energy if it is supplying it, right?
Grid.
Yeah.
So if they're
But the
buying
grid,
the energy from the grid, that's just the grid. They want to pay a more electricity bill, they will.
but somebody has to put power into that grid, which means it has to be permitted someplace, right?
What's permitted would be the hydroelectric or any of the electrical generating facilities, but not a warehouse that is just tied onto the grid.
Dr. Kellis, I think you're missing my point that anything that's going to generate power, that's going to create emissions, is going to be permitted. And there's a rule and system in place to be able to handle that. And you yourself are demonstrating in New York that you're taking steps to limit emissions based upon what you want to do in New York. And in fact, putting a moratorium on bringing on any of these other lines. So you're actually taking the steps doing it, right?
With all due respect, I'm being very clear, there is energy generation and there's energy usage. Energy generation is regulated. Energy usage, if you have a restaurant, or if you have a warehouse, or if you have a superstore, you are not permitted for your energy usage. Usage is not the same as generation. A generator is permitted. If you are not a generator, then you are not permitted in that way.
Right, and that was my point, is that all this power generation, not the use, the power generation is permitted, and New York is taking steps to do it. And is New York?
But the question is whether or not there is an opportunity cost, because the energy that is used, the significant amount of energy that is used, when we are trying to get our entire grid onto renewable energy infrastructure, if we are increasing our base load on that grid significantly, then we will have to increase significantly our renewable energy infrastructure construction goals. And the question is whether or not we have the land infrastructure and other ability to reach those goals, right? We have limited amount of land that we can build solar on, for example, and it competes directly with agricultural land and food production. So there are limits.
So is Nebraska New York, and vice versa, is New York Nebraska?
No, it is not.
So they're different states. So is it fair to say that different states are going to have different needs with regard to power generation and permitting and clean air and things like that?
Yes, and I would say with a caveat that any increased energy demands that you are putting on a grid means that you will need to produce more renewable energy infrastructure to make that grid completely renewable.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kellis. I've run way over.